Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We're going to take our next couple podcasts. We're going to be dealing with a very, very important story in David's life. It's 2 Samuel chapter 7. We're going to jump around into 1 Kings and Chronicles as well, because those books give different facets of this important story. And what we really get a glimpse of is what a great leader does when he arrives at, quote, the pinnacle of success, how he handles success, what he does with success, because it's not failure that really destroys us. It's success that often destroys us. And what we see inside of this is David handles his success very well. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1. Now it came to pass when the king was dwelling in his house, the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies all around, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells inside tents of curtain." Then Nathan said to the king, "Go do all that is in your heart for the Lord." I love this about David, and I think this is one of the things that truly singled David out as a man after God's own heart, and a leader by which God measured every other king that would succeed him. Here he is. He has success. There's really no more enemies to fight. He's got peace. He's got a palace. He has his life set. He hit all his goals. He's got the penthouse, the gold Rolex. He's arrived, right? He's got the private parking spot. He's got his Bentley Camel. He's there. And what is he thinking about? He's not just saying to himself, "Hey, you got a lot of great things. Just kick back and relax. You've earned all this." Do you know where his heart turns? It turns to God's house. He says, "Hey, I have all these things, and here I am dwelling in this palace. God gave me this. God gave me these victories. What am I doing allowing God's tabernacle to be in a tent? I want to build God a house." Now, I love this about David because he allowed his heart to continually go back to the things of God. Unfortunately, what I have often seen is people who become successful forget God. They're busy every weekend at the lake on their new ski-doos because they bought a lake house, and now God's blessed them with all these things. But the thing that God blessed them with takes them from God. It now becomes an idol that replaces God in their life. This also answers an important question many people ask, "But I've been praying, and why is not God blessing my business? And why am I not getting more clients? And why aren't we seeing more breakthrough?" Well, it might be that God hasn't answered that prayer for your success because he simply knows that success is going to take you away from him, and he isn't going to see you for the next 5 years or until the next major recession in the economy and that it hits your business. Then he's going to see you again because now you have margin and time for God. Often God doesn't give us the answer to our prayers because we're simply just praying for idols. I mean, if somebody came to you and said, "Pastor, God's not just answering my prayer." And then if I were to say, "Well, explain to me that prayer. What are you praying?" I'm saying, "Well, I'm praying, God, give me a Buddha statue, and God, give me a little statue of this." It would be obvious. Well, God's not going to answer that prayer to give you idols. But many of our prayers are exactly that. We're praying for idols. They don't have a little Buddha. They don't have little pagan images, but they're idols to us because they're things that will take us away from him. David's success didn't take him from God. What I love is David's success drew him closer to God. And what was he thinking about? He's thinking about God's house. Well, what's God's house today? It's the New Testament church. It's where you gather. It's where you get fed. It's where God's people come together to celebrate him, to hear the word, to worship his name, and then go into all the world and be equipped to be the church, the hands and feet of Jesus. A leader who's truly like David is always going back to this statement: "I know I'm blessed to be a blessing. I know that God has blessed me so I can bless and build his kingdom. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 11, God gave Israel this warning. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I've commanded you today, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, ... And God goes down a long list. When we are successful, it is when we tend to forget God the most. We get comfortable, we tend to forget God. That also answers the question why God often allows problems and pain as in our life. We go from one problem, it seems like, to the next problem. Why? Because it keeps us dependent on him, it keeps us seeking him, and it keeps us reminded that we need to be in God's house with God's people, celebrating him. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 18. But the Lord said to my father David, whereas it was in your heart to build a temple for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. What we're going to see in the next lesson is how David dealt with disappointment, because he didn't get to actually build the temple. We're going to see how he got past that disappointment and turned it into a great stepping stone for success. But what I love about this is how Solomon described his dad. This is part of his dad's eulogy, just a big statement. And I loved what God said. Because it was in your heart to build my house, because you were thinking about my house, it was your heart, you did well. My prayer is that that would be what God says about all of us. As business leaders in the community, God's blessing your business, expanding your influence, and as you're managing, as you're getting promoted, as you're getting increased, may it be said of you, hey, great job, because while I was blessing you, it was in your heart to continually build my house. Next week, we're going to see how David deals with disappointment, because we all have things we want to do that we don't get to do. What do we do in those moments? See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.